Welcome to the 1840 podcast, where each month we explore a different topic balancing modern sensibilities with traditional sensitivities to give you new approaches to timeless Jewish ideas. I'm your host, David Beshefkin, and today we have a special episode exploring humor and Purim, of course. This podcast is part of a larger exploration of those big, juicy Jewish ideas. So be sure to check out 1840.org, that's 18forty.org, where you can also find videos, articles, recommended readings, and weekly emails. This is a strange time to be recording a Purim episode. We're about to enter a holiday which really celebrates silliness, upside-downness, humor, laughter, this Misha Nichnas Adar Marben Besimcha, the entering of the month of Adar, even the very month, is supposed to increase in joy. Yet when you look around, there is a strange incongruity. We have issues going on in the world. We are recording this in March 2022. Russia has invaded Ukraine. There is a sense of forebodingness where the world is really at the edge of their seats. And it seems like a strange time to be discussing, thinking about anything joyous. And in many ways, it's an apt time to reflect on the limitations and opportunities of comedy itself. I've long considered myself, and I've mentioned many times before on this podcast, that I am a student of late night television. And included within late night television, we've spoken about Conan and Jay and David Letterman and all the other greats. But included within late night television is Saturday Night Live. I've said many times that I consider Lorne Michaels kind of a Rebbe of sorts, and how to be a Rebbe and how to spot and nurture talent. My own Rebbe, Rabbi Moshe Benovitz of NCSY Kollel, a summer program that NCSY runs. He was my Rebbe in high school. I sometimes jokingly call him the Lorne Michaels of Chinuch, of Jewish education, in his ability to kind of spot out emerging talent of people who have gone through his summer program and gone on to all of these incredible leadership positions. There's something really remarkable about Saturday Night Live and how it's evolved over many, many generations. Everybody, of course, loves the Saturday Night Live. Lorne Michaels has said that everybody's favorite era of Saturday Night Live is the one that they were in high school, and there are a lot of reasons why people hate Saturday Night Live now. They love to hate it. They love to talk about it. But one of the things in Saturday Night Live that I always find very interesting is their opening montage, where there's always an opening skit, and then all of a sudden they break from the script and they say, live from New York, it's Saturday Night Live.
Live from New York, it's Saturday night!
And it's kind of this signature piece of the show. It's changed the opening. The only thing that's actually stayed the same on the show is the outro music. But everything else on the show has evolved. But one thing that I've always found interesting is how Saturday Night Live reacts when there is trauma going on in the world. And I've actually found it on many occasions to be incredibly moving. I think most famously, their opening monologue in their first episode following September 11th, there was a hesitance, like, is this something that we can still do, to get up and make jokes and talk about silliness and all of this ridiculousness? Can we still do that in this world after September 11th? And it was quite a famous monologue where they had the mayor of New York City at the time, Mayor Rudy Giuliani, in dialogue with Lorne Michaels.
On behalf of everyone here, I just want to thank you all for being here tonight, and especially you, Mr. Mayor.
Thank you, Warren. Thank you very much. Having our city's institutions up and running sends a message that New York City is open for business. Saturday Night Live is one of our great New York City institutions, and that's why it's important for you to do your show tonight.
Can we be funny?
Why start now?
And it was a really poignant opening. The joke happened to have worked. It really kind of broke the ice in a way. Why start now? But it allowed people to begin creating a window for humor to enter their lives. And I watched closely to how Saturday Night Live dealt with the introduction in the first episode after the war broke out in Ukraine, of how they would handle it. It was actually incredibly moving. They had this opening montage where instead of a skit, instead of Live from New York, instead they had a choir, a Ukrainian choir, kind of sing a song together.
Ladies and gentlemen, the Ukrainian Chorus Dumka of New York. Live from New York, it's Saturday night.
And it was a poignant way to kind of create a window that even with all this suffering going on in the world, we can have this window, this entry point to bring joy and laughter into our lives without making light, so to speak, of the suffering and pain in the world. But there is a universe where these two things can coexist. And it's something that I personally struggle with. You know, I am fairly active online on social media, most notably on Twitter. And when these things break out, like these are mistakes that I've made and things that I've had to navigate. I remember on January 6th when they went into the Capitol, when it first started, like I didn't totally know what was going on. And I made a meme out of one of the things that was happening. And it was definitely wrong and it was a mistake. And somebody like reached out to me and said, like, now is not the time for your cute little jokes. Like there's something very real happening. And to diminish something very real, to diminish something that's bringing a lot of suffering is not something I ever want to be guilty of. And I remember after that day, I took like a 3-day break. I said, like, you know, I don't really have the words to process what's going on right now. I don't want to memify a very serious moment for our country. And in a similar way, I've been fairly careful during this entire episode. There's war breaking out. There are refugees. There are people suffering. This isn't a time, for me personally at least, people need to memify what is going on. They don't need silly captions. They need our financial support. They need our donations. They need our prayers, our tefillos. They need help in so many other ways. But at the same time, it can feel claustrophobic, like there's no way to talk about anything. And when you feel that claustrophobia, it's very hard to be funny about anything, quite frankly. The one thing that I did share, and I wish I could show it to you. You can go onto my Twitter account, but there's a very funny picture. I don't know where it's from. It might be from some episode or it's Photoshop. There was this picture of Darth Vader leading like a group of stormtroopers, and among the stormtroopers, just out of the blue, you see Big Bird from Sesame Street among the stormtroopers being led by Darth Vader. And I looked at that picture with Darth Vader and all of the, you know, dark side stormtroopers, all this darkness, and Big Bird, this big fluffy yellow bird in the middle. I said, this is kind of what it must feel like ushering in Purim in the month of Adar with the entire world in absolute and utter chaos. You know, there's something that's extraordinarily out of place. But there's also something very moving about this incongruity, about these distinctions. There's something deeply poignant and almost emblematic of humor itself in noticing this incongruity. The philosopher Arthur Schopenhauer, in his book The World as Will and Idea, actually develops a theory of what makes something funny. And he writes as follows: the cause of laughter in every case is simply the sudden perception of the incongruity between a concept and the real objects which have been thought through it in some relation. And laughter itself is just the expression of this incongruity. According to Schopenhauer, and in many ways this is reflected in the writings of the Maharal and other Jewish thinkers, laughter is kind of noticing and highlighting deep incongruities. When you see a businessman who's wearing an extraordinarily fancy suit, and he's looking all self-important, and as he's rushing into some very important meeting, suddenly slips on a banana peel. It's a classic scene that is going to evoke laughter because of that incongruity of the self-importance of the businessman and the silliness of slipping on a banana peel. If you would imagine that same exact scene, but instead of a businessman, it would be somebody who is downtrodden, broken, zerbrochen, just really not 100%, and they slip on a banana peel, nobody's going to laugh. There's no incongruity there. There's no dissonance. There's no surprise that is going to be filled with laughter. And in many ways, what Purim is as a whole is noticing that larger incongruity in the world. And it's not just Purim. I think there is a rich tradition in Jewish history to be able to stare at darkness and suffering and find, even within that deep incongruity, in the very absurdity of suffering and pain itself, to find a point where Purim can shed light and bring laughter. Our friend and a member of the 1840 team, Yehuda Fogel, who sends out our weekly emails and he runs our social media. He was actually on that episode when we had him and Dina discussing reader feedback. He's an incredible thinker and he's really wonderful on social media. It's a social media account where he's at Yehuda HaMaccabi. That's Yehuda HaMaccabi, HaMaccabi. So this Yehuda Fogel, who works with us on 1840, had an absolutely incredible thread which showed pictures of Jews following the Holocaust in a DP camp in Landsberg, Germany, where survivors almost put on Purim spiels to process their pain from the Holocaust. That survivors made a mock grave for Haman and Hitler on Purim. It's really remarkable that he has these pictures that he posted on Twitter. I think they're from some photo archives that I'm sure you could find online. But it has a tombstone that I can actually read for you. On the top of the tombstone, there's a swastika, and then underneath are the classic letters that are on many Jewish tombstones. Pei Nun, which is an acronym for Po Nitman. Here is buried, and underneath it writes, Tzorei HaYehudim, the oppressor of the Jewish people, Haman ben Hamdasa, Haman, who is featured, of course, in the Megillah we read on Purim, and then underneath it is written in Hebrew, Aleph Daled Aleph Lamed Pei Adolf Hey Yud Tes Lamed Ayin Resh Adolf Hitler. And there is this mock gravesite that they made out of cardboard. And there's almost a absurdity, a silliness, dare I say, in the way that they are processing their own pain and suffering. In Buchenwald, he has a picture of this too. They had an effigy of Hitler hanging outside of the bunker. There were people in those DP camps who actually dressed up as a zombified, a post-mortem, a humiliated Hitler. And it's just remarkable where you see these pictures of young children, probably in the late 1940s, maybe early 1950s. I don't have an exact date. But you do see pictures of young children dressing up, that Purim in a DP camp in the shadow of the Holocaust still found a way, with all of that incongruity, maybe because of that incongruity, to find a window to celebrate Purim. And this very notion of looking at incongruity and the humor which emerges from incongruity as a window and expression of Jewish humor is famously satired in that wonderful Seinfeld episode that I think we must have quoted once before. It's so good. How could we not quote it again? With the great Bryan Cranston starring as the character Tim Whatley, who converts to Judaism, and Jerry is concerned that he converted because of the jokes.
Anyway, I wanted to talk to you about Dr. Whatley. I have a suspicion that he's converted to Judaism purely for the jokes.
And this offends you as a Jewish person?
No, it offends me as a comedian.
And Jerry finally confronts him as, his dentist, Tim Whatley, is working on his teeth. And he wonders, you've been a Jew for 5 minutes already. Should you be making Jewish jokes already?
That which reminds me, did you hear the one about the rabbi and the farmer's daughter? Huh? Those aren't matzo balls. What?
Tim, do you think you should be making jokes like that?
Why not? I'm Jewish, remember?
I know, but...
Jerry, it's our sense of humor that sustained us as a people for 3,000 years.
5,000.
5,000, even better. Okay. Chrissy, give me a shtickle of fluorite.
And then he asked the assistant for a shtickle of fluoride.
Why are you so concerned about this?
I'll tell you why. Because I believe Whatley converted to Judaism just for the jokes.
But this is really part of a long historical conversation that is about how Jews use humor to talk about anti-Semitism, and more largely how humor is used, and if humor should be used at all, to confront pain and suffering. I think for me personally, when I am the witness of enduring current suffering, what's going on in Ukraine, it's happening right now, I don't have the privilege, the responsibility, the allowance to use humor to talk about this because they're suffering right in front of me. The distinction that I make in my own life is that I would use humor to process my own suffering. I'm not going to use humor to process somebody else's suffering. But this is a larger question that's really happening at this moment about the use of humor specifically, not just to deal with suffering in general, but to talk about anti-Semitism. There was an absolutely wonderful article in the New York Times called "Is It Funny for the Jews?" that was written by Jason Zinnoman. This was published on February 17th, 2022, and this was about a cultural critic, which Jason is. He said, a sense of humor is integral to his Jewish identity, but these dark times raise existential questions about comedy and its uses. The question is it appropriate to be talking about anti-Semitism, to be talking about something that is so real going on right now? We see it in videos, Jews getting beaten up on the streets, hostage crises taking place in Texas, Jews getting murdered because of their identity. Is there any room to even discuss this through a lens of humor? As he writes in the article, there is a long, rich Jewish tradition of grappling with anti-Semitism by laughing at it. This has produced a vast amount of great comedy, from Mel Brooks turning Nazis into musical theater buffoons in The Producers, to Sacha Baron Cohen in character as Borat, leading the denizens of a southern bar and singing "Throw the Jews Down the Well." There's a sensibility behind these jokes that I grew up around and have long embraced. Some artists argue, the article continues, that making light of prejudice or turning purveyors of it into absurdities robs hatred of power. I've been persuaded by that idea, and like many secular types, a Jewish sense of humor is more integral to my identity than any religious observance. It's also a source of pride. A resilient comic sensibility that finds joy in dark places is one of the greatest Jewish legacies, as is an ability to laugh at ourselves. But he pauses for a moment and he says, there's been growing pushback in the last year from some Jews about double standards in the cultural conversation. Whether or not when we depict Jews and use humor in these ways, are we reinforcing certain stereotypes that actually prevent a more redemptive, prevent that agency that the Jewish people rightfully deserve from us as a people actually taking hold of it? And he highlights two artists who actually take a very different approach to this. The article continues, and I'm reading a little bit further on. For Jews like myself with family photos featuring relatives murdered in the Holocaust, this point stopped me cold. The notion that maybe not everything merits a joke. There are signs of a new, more sober attitude towards anti-Semitism among younger Jewish artists. The 26-year-old Hannah Einbinder, she is an actress and comedian. She stars in this HBO show Hacks. I'm not going to confirm or have any spoilers whether or not she makes a brief cameo on this very episode, because she may or may not be dating the person who we're about to speak to. But no spoilers. But she does quote from the wonderful, absolutely lovely Hannah Einbinder, the 26-year-old Hannah Einbinder, who has integrated a long Hebrew prayer into her stand-up set, has said she stayed off Twitter in part because of anti-Semitism, and always wears a Star of David necklace, which I've always found so moving. The artists who have taken a greater, more public stance in promoting and highlighting their own Jewish identity. But then he gets to the person who we're speaking with today, and that is the comic Alex Edelman. And he writes the comic Alex Edelman, who's just 32, built his extremely funny Off Broadway show Just for Us around visiting a white nationalist meeting in Queens, having conversations with anti-Semites that eventually culminate in confrontation. His show is poignantly pessimistic about the ability of comedy to combat bigotry. And I think in many ways in this moment that we are in right now, when the world seems to be aflame in chaos, and we're all kind of quietly, collectively wondering, what does it mean to have a Purim? What does it mean to be joyful in the face of such suffering? There's nobody that I am more excited to introduce from a comedic perspective than this Alex Edelman, whose entire show, which is having an incredible moment right now. He had a review in the New York Times. He's mentioned in this article, which is absolutely wonderful. Again, the article that I read from is, of course, called Is It Funny for the Jews? But his show, Just for Us, Alex Edelman show Just for Us, just finished a run. He is going to have a second run in New York City, and you want to make sure that you're able to check that out. I would urge you to get tickets. He is having an incredible moment right now, and part of the reason why it makes me so excited is because he's just like us, like the very title of his show. He's deeply Jewish. He grew up in the modern Orthodox community of Brookline, Massachusetts, and this was not an easy time to get a hold of Alex. He has a show that is getting international attention that I know so many people have gone to see. It was sold out every single night. I believe the second run is also going to be sold out. You really want to see this. Alex has performed. He's been on television. He performed on Conan. We'll talk about that opening joke, which is absolutely wonderful, where he says he has tried cocaine, but he's never had bacon. And if you listen very closely, you can hear somebody in the crowd scream out, Kol HaKavod.
I'm an Orthodox Jew. Yeah. I've never had bacon. I'm that kind of Jew. I've never tried bacon. I've tried cocaine, but I've never tried bacon.
And truly, while I wouldn't interrupt somebody's comedy set with that, Kol HaKavod to everything that Alex Edelman has been talking about and achieving. His show is able to embrace the particularity of his own upbringing and translate it into the universal language of comedy. It's able to confront something deeply serious like anti-Semitism and put it into a frame of a one-man comedic show. And some way, somehow, he is able to navigate it. Dare I say that it is part of his Talmudic upbringing, and he may or may not, no spoilers again, give a shout out to Rabbi Soloveitchik in his very show, but it's that almost Talmudic, dare I say, brisker methodology, which is known for kind of the bifurcated conceptual categories that they create in the way that they analyze texts. And he's able to almost analyze the moment and bifurcate between suffering and comedy. With his philosophical breadth and comedic spirit, he's able to contain both. And on a personal note, it's really remarkable the different ways that Alex and I have intersected, and Lord knows he was so patient with me and so kind with me because I kept on throwing these personal connections at him, begging him to find a moment, and he was so gracious that he did. But I'll just share with you now because it brought a smile to my face, the different ways that our lives have intersected. I stayed for Shabbos in the Jewish Center in the Upper West Side at a dear, someone who's become a friend, and his apartment should be turned into a museum, the great Simcha Lyons. And I was staying at his house for the weekend. I was the Skan resident, and he said, I have to leave right after Shabbos. And I said, where are you going? Like, you hitting the town? Like, why do you have to leave right away? He says, my closest friend's son is putting on a comedy show and me and my wife are going. I said, who's that? And he said, Alex Edelman. I said, no way. I know Alex Edelman because there was a mayoral race in the 5 towns where there was like a mudslinging campaign against one of the candidates, and his name was Alex Edelman. And the actual Alex Edelman, the one who we're talking today, actually got in touch with me, and he was like, what is going on in the 5 towns? Why is Alex Edelman all over the news? Can somebody please clarify to the world, and more specifically the 5 towns, that this is not me? We also have a mutual Rebbe, a former 1840 guest. Alex and myself are dear friends and both students, Talmidim of sorts, of the great Gary Gulman, who I think more than anyone else really blazed a path in being able to confront issues of the utmost importance and the utmost seriousness through a comedic lens, as we spoke about when he was a guest on this show, his work that he's done about bridging mental health problems, depression, in his wonderful HBO set called The Great Depression. And you could go back and check us out on 1840.org to listen to our conversation with Gary Gulman. And finally, what I didn't know, but I think he mentions in our conversation, he's actually chavrusas with a dear friend of mine who many of our listeners, I forward her several emails, have asked us to have as a future guest on our show. And that is the wonderful Sarah Hurwitz, who wrote the book Here All Along. Now, Sarah Hurwitz actually is a fairly common name. There are a lot of Sarah Hurwitzes out there. This is the Sarah Hurwitz who is the former speechwriter for Hillary Clinton, and she wrote a lovely book called Here All Along, and we have gotten several. Anytime we put out an interview, and we've gotten several emails from listeners saying, you got to have Sarah Hurwitz on. I happen to know her quite well. We've been in touch really recently. She's absolutely lovely and wonderful, and I was smitten when I heard that her weekly chavrusa is with none other than Alex Edelman. So with everything that he has going on, and he has so much going on, so much success, and kol hakavod to him for it, how could he say no with all of these intersections and overlaps in our respective lives? And it was so kind and gracious of him, with everything he has going on and with all of his success that he has been seeing, that he gave us a few moments to talk about life, comedy, and the philosophy of comedy, and maybe a lens to understand how to confront even the most serious things in the world with the joyousness that comedy brings. And I think there's no time better than now to have a discussion with a philosopher comedian, and it is my absolute pleasure to introduce our conversation with Alex Edelman. One of the things that I'm really fascinated by is you've shared your own religious journey. You know, when you first appeared on Conan, which was a really beautiful moment, you have this great joke about you've never eaten bacon, but you've tried cocaine. I remember in that opening moment, somebody in the crowd, I think, screams out in Israeli, like, Yasher Koach or Chas v'Shalom.
No, they scream Kol HaKavod.
Kol HaKavod in that moment. And you kind of talk about the own vicissitudes of your religious journey. And I'm curious if you could share a little bit about how your comedic journey, if at all, is intertwined or correlated with your own religious identity.
I think it's heavily correlated in terms of craft, which is that the viewpoint is Talmudic. I think the strength is that it considers things from places that are not binary. And when my work is good, it does that well. When my work is at its most simple, it doesn't. But I think understanding the dark irony of things and understanding the and sort of understanding the perspectives of multivalence perspective can kind of help. And I think it's been really positive, and or I've had it I've experienced it as a really positive experience. And yeah, I don't know. I really enjoy it. I really enjoy like what I mean by enjoying it is like I get a lot by translating my upbringing and my viewpoint that comes from that upbringing into my craft. So that's a bit of a self-serious answer, but I'm sure you know what I mean.
And I love your self-seriousness. It really is profound because you do have like a deeply philosophical take in your humor from the very beginning. I'm curious, you grew up in a deeply belly of the beast, modern Orthodox home. You give Rabbi Soloveitchik a shout out in your latest acclaimed special, Just for Us, which I think is going on a second tour. And I'm curious, you took a very unconventional path after, a belly of the beast, modern Orthodox upbringing, Brookline. I think you're a Maimonides graduate, if I have my facts straight, which I could be getting that wrong. I'm curious if the rupture from the typical path of, someone who was raised in this like Brookline, Boston, modern Orthodox home, what do you attribute the fact that you took such an unconventional journey in developing? You didn't become a doctor or a lawyer like so many of us.
Yeah, but I don't think that, with all due respect, I don't think that there was ever, those doors.
I don't think modern Orthodox people know that those doors are open to them, but those doors were never closed to me. My parents always encouraged me to do something that I could, that would give me a parnassa, but also that would, like let me pursue what I wanted to. And also my mom once said to me, this is one time, but it was illuminating. She went, don't be trapped behind a desk.
Wow.
Or find a job where you're not trapped behind a desk. Like, it's just I think there's this conception of modern Orthodox people as these, there's one question that I get that's the stupidest question in the world. And I tend to think that there are very few stupid questions. But the stupidest question is when, your parents are okay with this. And it's usually from Jews. And it's astounding. And I just think, your poor kids. Your poor kids that, you want. Or people say that, but they don't, if you're a modern Orthodox parent listening to this, please don't try to make your kid to some professional drone. Please don't try to make your kids have the seichel to make a beautiful living in a way that doesn't require, all this postgraduate work. And especially if they don't want to do it. And my upbringing, there was never, religiously, there's been a rupture in the sense that I have to work on Shabbos and I'm not happy about it. And there have been complicated payment arrangements in the past to make it so that I'm not paid for the work on the Shabbos. It's a really...
Like a youth director in every shul.
Yeah, exactly. But or a meal at Russ and Daughters when it was still open at the Jewish Museum, right? It's just it's
sure.
Kosher because we paid on but religiously that's been challenging. And if I ever get to a place where I'm extremely successful, it will mean shows late on Saturday night and no shows Friday night. But that's a longer conversation. So religiously there's been that. And I haven't been excited about certain things, but there was never any philosophical rupture. My parents were always very pleased with me, doing what I wanted to do. And I really do think that I always answer it patiently because I understand that people live a certain...
It's so painful for me to hear that you get that question, particularly from Jews. It's not surprising at all, but it's kind of that intersection between orthodoxy, modern Orthodoxy as a socioeconomic status versus a religious identity.
It's really silly. It's a silly question, but I understand why people ask it. I understand why people ask it because, people don't know.
Yeah.
People don't see many modern Orthodox kids becoming comics. There are friends of mine who have become Jewish comedians, but I don't like that either, if I'm being honest.
For sure.
I like them. I like them and they're funny and they're good at it, but that's not for me,
Correct. You've broken out, which is actually what I wanted to ask you. There's always this instinctive feeling, particularly within the modern Orthodox community, which is a very teeny tiny subset of the larger Orthodox community, of the larger Jewish community, of the larger religious community. And there's always this hand wringing of how we present and tell our story. I find it upsetting sometimes the level of outrage that people feel when we feel like someone is telling an Orthodox story that doesn't fit into the norms or the values that we try to uphold or live by. I was wondering if you could give advice to the modern Orthodox community about how they could better share their stories and values to a wider community.
I'm in no position to give anyone advice, but I'll say that I'm not, we had a Q&A, the AJC came to the show and there was a talk back afterwards. First time I've ever done a talk back. And it was pretty interesting. And after the show, they said one of the last question, which was the best question, is what is your dream for the, what is your dream for the future of Judaism? And I was like, oh my God, Jonathan Sachs is dead, leave it alone. But we'll say the question again, David, so I can answer concisely. What's my advice for the modern Orthodox community?
Of how to tell their story. I feel like there's a lot of frustration when a lot of times the story is told very artfully. I like a lot of them. We've had them as guests on our show, people who leave Orthodoxy and then say the story. And it feels like you contend with something that's real and alive while you're still surrounded by it.
Yeah, I'm still in it. I'm still modern Orthodox. Well, first of all, we have to understand that modern Orthodoxy is an extension of Judaism, which is that you're Jewish. I say in the show that Judaism's like the Hotel California. It's the mailing list you can never unsubscribe from. And so a Jewish life is a life that is entirely, it's not optional. And so that requires some effort on the part of the individual and reckoning with that, but it also requires some effort on the part of the institution and the kahila in accepting people who maybe have lives or compulsions or, lifestyles that don't fit in with tradition. Like frankly, modern orthodoxy has to get its arms, like in my ideal version of modern orthodoxy, it gets its arms around thorny issues that different people within the community find unacceptable. And I, can feel modern Orthodox listeners already recoiling.
No, this is great.
But I think that the Judaism that I dream of is one that doesn't sacrifice, that is still deeply rooted in traditional values, but is equipped to deal with modern challenges. You need to deal with the fact that female rabbis is something that the Orthodox community or modern Orthodox community needs to reckon with. I worry that more conservative elements of I say that not politically, I mean religiously, more conservative elements of the Jewish spectrum has abandoned inclusion to the liberal elements. And I worry that the liberal elements has abandoned rigorousness to the more conservative elements, if that makes sense.
That is actually quite profound. But I think I'm asking a different question, and I know we're tight on time, but I'm wondering if you could weigh in.
No, go ahead.
How did you figure out how to share your particularity, the specificity of a modern Orthodox upbringing?
The specific is universal. Everyone has a background that they feel beholden to. Everyone feels like there's a line in Jackie Mason's show that was quoted in this article in the New York Times a few weeks ago that he said, non-Jews walk out of my show and go, it's a hit. Jews walk out of my show and go, it's too Jewish. But our experience is a universal experience. The movie, My Big Fat Greek Wedding, every culture looked at that movie and was like, that's my Jewish wedding. That's my Indian family. That's my Malaysian cousins. The modern Orthodox story is very about the tension between traditional and modern. That's a universal story. The question about assimilation in the United States, that's a universal story. It's not just us who have, our stories, every personal story, including and especially Orthodox and modern Orthodox ones, have great valence too. One of my favorite books is the book My Name is Asher Lev by Chaim Patak.
Sure.
It's this incredible book about a Hasidic child who wants to be an artist. And Tom Hanks on Alan Alda's podcast said it was his favorite book. And Lin-Manuel Miranda has talked repeatedly about how he desperately wanted to adapt it before Hamilton. I assume Lin-Manuel Miranda is rather busy. And someone said to me, how does Lin-Manuel Miranda, how can he connect to My Name is Asher Lev? And I said, oh, you mean the guy who's the son of a proud community organizer and maybe one of the most prominent, Lin-Manuel Miranda's father was and remains one of the most influential Puerto Ricans in the United States. And his son wanted to be a slam poet. Yeah. So I think he probably can understand a book about a Hasidic kid whose father is a very important emissary for the Lubavitcher Rebbe, and decides that he wants to be an artist. Sorry, that's a long example.
No, it's bullseye. The universality of specificity of the particular is what you really do so masterfully on your show. I'm curious. I know for myself, I'm not a big time comedian. Most of my jokes are shared on Twitter or in the pages. I don't write for them anymore, but once upon a time in the pages of Mishpacha magazine, I wrote a humor column. I'm curious, how did you discover that you were funny? Was it the normal Sheva Brachos, Ufra speeches? How did you discover you were good at this?
I've given I've given a few funny bar mitzvah speeches, but I didn't by the way,
You weren't the go-to Ufra speaker? I don't believe that.
I wasn't. I'm telling you though, I perform now at Sheva Brachos and things like that. I don't do the brisk business that Modi does, but I'll say this. I never thought that I was funny. And I still don't think that I'm not like a tummeler, and I think that it's one of those things where Gary Goldman has said this too. It's a craft and you work at it. 90% of being a comedian to me is being a decent editor. knowing what's funny and what's not funny in real time. But a lot of that comes from experience and taste and tact and understanding the relationship between tension and release. But when I was a kid, I had a really wonderful boss at the Red Sox. I worked at the Red Sox as a kid. I wrote the kids' newsletter and did some PR stuff.
Super cool job.
Yeah, it was a really cool job. It was wonderful. And I had this boss named Larry Lucchino, who is this Italian American guy from Pittsburgh, from Squirrel Hill. And he just took a real, I haven't spoken to him in a couple of weeks, but we used to speak really, really frequently. And we still do, actually, but I've lapsed the last few weeks because I've been so busy. But Larry found me funny pretty early on. And as a kid, really gave me lots of credit. But my grandfather, my papa was very funny. My grandmother was very funny. And I was raised in a house where that was a currency. It wasn't the currency. Wisdom was the currency. But I think having that, there was an abundance of good cheer in my grandparents' home in Boston growing up. And to a lesser extent, but still a central extent, my parents' home. They valued comedy and they valued it in the right way, which was as a demonstration of intellect and a demonstration of good attitude. So I don't know if sometimes I demur when people ask me, like, when did you first know you were funny? Because I don't feel like I, ever have been like, I'm funny now. But I can say that I knew that it was a really important growing up. I think I'm a little emotional. My grandfather was this wonderful man who just passed away at the end of December. So
how much it happened, Aliyah.
Thank you.
So let me actually ask something, and it's similar to the question that I led with, but I'm hoping you can shed light on it, and I hope it's not one of the questions that you absolutely hate.
There are very few.
Let's see if this is on your short list. You have a trajectory and a level of success on the wider scale that few people growing up in the modern Orthodox world have achieved in the media space, meaning we have plenty of doctors, scientists, politicians, all sorts of stuff. Very few have achieved this in the world of media. And thank God, especially as of late, I mean, this is you've been on Conan years ago, you've been on television, but as of late, the attention you've gotten for your special is something really remarkable. And I think a lot of people who would be on that level of attention, publicity, opportunity, it would inversely affect or deleteriously affect their religious identity. And I'm curious, what do you attribute the resiliency of your upbringing, religious identity, that you haven't, I'm going to say it very bluntly, you haven't just left. I mean, there's so much opportunity. There's so much that
you can't leave, David. There's no way to leave. There's no way to go. Like, by the way, I truly believe that, if you say you're modern Orthodox, you're modern Orthodox. Like, sometimes people come up to me after shows, they go, you don't wear a yarmulke, you're not modern Orthodox. And I just go, okay, fine. But, I feel modern, my thinking and reading is around, Martin Buber's I Thou relationship with God and Soloveitchik's Lonely Man of Faith. And I have Chavrusa with our mutual friend Sarah Hurwitz every week. And my home is a Jewish home in the sense that it's filled with conversation about this. There's no, if I ate bacon, I've never had bacon as the joke you quoted said, but if I ate bacon wrapped Torah scrolls 10 meals a day and picked my teeth with a ner tamid, it doesn't. If you think you're modern Orthodox, you're modern Orthodox.
Sounds like a modern Orthodox aristocrats joke just now that you wove.
Yeah. That's a very specific thing, but there's no way to leave. I don't fully understand. If someone says to me, I'm not modern Orthodox anymore, in the back of my mind, I go, okay, but what's your relationship like with yourself? What's your relationship like with your it's one of those things where I can be a modern Orthodox Jew who's not even sure that he, believes in God and is still firmly in the tradition of modern Orthodoxy. So but I get your question. Your question is, how have you not, internally, because people respect honest audiences respect emotional honesty that they can identify with and authenticity that they can identify with. And working with Mike Birbiglia, just a little bit of Mike Birbiglia, who's producing my show, is
huge fan of his.
He's the master of the form in American solo show comedy. He is the unquestioned he's a gadol hador in this. He really is, though. I say that to him sometimes, and he has no idea what the I'm talking about. But I'll say, pardon my language, by the way. But like he said, you can bleep that if you like, or cut
I'll bleep that in case your Rabbeim listen. Don't worry.
Yeah. Please bleep. But Mike is and by the way, if you're not Jewish, gadol hador is like a great of the generation. Like there are very few people who maintain, we're talking like Rav Moshe Feinstein or Hank Greenberg. Like they're very few.
Exactly.
But Mike is that. And he really, really encourages it. And he's encouraging an even deeper emotional honesty that I'm not always 100% sure I want or, audiences want. But of course, he's right. And pursuing a bit more of it would be leaning into the person that I am, which is someone who thinks deeply about the Judaism that's invested in his life, as opposed to running away from that. Because running away from that would be dishonest. If I ever start feeling disconnected from my Judaism, my comedy will reflect that. The show happens to coincide with me experiencing, finding more of a community. We made this thing called Saturday Night Seder, me and some friends, which was at the beginning of the pandemic, which was wonderful. And I found more of a Jewish community instead of less of one. But, in times in my life where I'm sure if my comedy is good, or my comedy is reflective of who I am, then that disconnect will be profound. People will be able to, understand what I'm feeling about my own religion by me saying that I'm not feeling it. So does that make sense, David?
No, it does. It's, to me, my only lament is twofold. Number one, that we still have never met in person despite our countless personal connections. And number two, that of all of the interviews that I've done on 1840, this is going to require the most translation, which is something that I actually.
What have I said? Gadol hador, I guess.
Ner
right?
Tamid, you dropped the Ner Tamid. I can't get enough of it. I love it.
Ner Tamid is the thing that, the eternal flame that sits above an ark in a synagogue. What else?
No. You've been absolutely perfect. I've already taken up more of your time. Do you have time for one more general question?
Sure. Go ahead.
Here's a general question, which I didn't see fully surfaced in a lot of your interviews, but it really comes back to the question that you hate. And that is, I think that a lot of the reason, particularly in modern Orthodoxy, why people seek stable, more typical jobs, more stable jobs, is because there is an anxiety that we associate by taking unknown paths. And I'm curious for you, both comedy and Jewish life and Jewish community is associated with a certain angst, a certain anxiety of becoming, of arriving. And I'm curious for you how your comedy and religious identity intersects with your own mental health. Is it something that aggravates at the success that you've been having? Is Judaism and comedy something that is intertwined with an angst and anxiety that I seem to hear in your voice, but it's not something that I've heard you really unpack at length?
That's a good question. I have angst and I have anxiety. I don't know if those things stem entirely from my Judaism. What's interesting is when you start as a comic, and Gary will tell you this, I was not a very good comedian when I started. The comics that are starting now or have started in the last 5 years, they're much better comedians than the comics that started comedy 10 years ago at the outset of their careers, because they have better influences, or their influences are in a better place. Like some of my influences are these really horrific Boston comedians and these really horrific New York comedians. You see them in comedy clubs and I have bad comedy influences, a couple of them. I had good ones like Gary Goldman, but it wasn't uncommon to be on a show with, for me to walk into a comedy club and see 5 terribly edgy comics who were, sexist or self-effacing in a way that was horrific, or, angry, and Gary. And that's why Gary was such a light. And there were there are a couple of other exceptions that if I thought hard, I'd remember. But I saw a lot of bad comedy. And so I think a lot of my angst is around, the comedian that I was, or the comedy voice that, the comedy voice that maybe I could be if I hadn't been so awful when I started.
Interesting.
And so, I think in my anxiety now, it revolves a lot around, I think a lot of my identity in the first few years of my comedy as a professional was about not being very worthy of any sort of, I think I've got some self-loathing there. And also the anxiety of, people seem to largely like the show now, but it won't, maybe it won't always be the case. But I'm also learning to enjoy it a little bit. I'm enjoying the fact that people seem to be connecting with this show. Our run starts back up on March 14th. I know that when will this air? Purim, so it's a few.
This is our pre-Purim episode, and just the links that you went out to do this, we will make sure that there is a link to get tickets, and the last show sold out.
Sure.
And all of our listeners must listen to this. We've taken up way more of your time than you ever promised. I always end my interview with rapid fire questions.
Sure.
One of which you've already answered. Let's do it really quickly. Here we go.
Sure, go ahead.
What is a book that you would recommend to help somebody better appreciate the messages and values that you've been sharing through your comedy and really about your Jewish identity? You mentioned My Name is Asher Lev. Give us another book.
Nathan Englander's For the Relief of Unbearable Urges.
Fantastic. Yes.
He's wonderful. It's an incredible book. It's a collection of short stories that understands the Orthodox Jewish identity better than any other American book. And his other stuff is truly like Dinner at the Center of the Earth and Kaddish.com are two really glorious books, but nothing touches, for my money, nothing touches For the Relief of Unbearable Urges, at least as an introduction.
An awesome suggestion.
Yeah.
If somebody gave you a great deal of money and allowed you to take a sabbatical without any responsibilities to go back to school and get a PhD, what do you think the topic and title of your PhD dissertation would be?
Jeez, come on. I don't know. Hold on, my girlfriend's here. Hannah, what would the topic of if someone gave me an insane amount of money and I could and I was supposed to go back to school and write a PhD dissertation, what would it be on?
Hannah, you're more than welcome to jump in on this as well.
Well, I know what my joke answer is.
What's your joke? What's the joke answer?
No, I can't say that.
You can't say.
We've already bleeped part of this interview, so it's
okay. Well, I think my Kim. I don't know.
Alex really loves nature and hiking, and he's spent a lot of time in places like Arizona and Utah, and so maybe like allegories for Judaism within the natural world.
That's really, really beautiful.
I love that.
That's absolutely perfectly. That's an insight. You want to talk about seichel? I want to talk about wisdom. That's an insight I really love the national parks. So also, when I was at NYU, I was a TA for a class called Baseball's Road to God. So it was about baseball as an American religion. So maybe something about that, even though my old professor, John Sexton, very ably tackled the topic in his book called Baseball's Road to God, but maybe something around that.
But both are fantastic answers. My final question, and then I will let you go on your hike, and I can't thank you enough for this, and I hope it's okay if we include that brief snippet from Hannah's suggestion as well. What time do you go to sleep at night, and what time do you wake up in the morning?
Okay, I go to bed around midnight or 1 a.m. and I wake up around 7 or 8, pretty much no matter what happens. So that's the sad truth.
Oh, wow. Torah true. That's quite the modern Orthodox schedule. I appreciate it. Alex, go enjoy. I cannot thank you enough. I hope we meet again under less annoying circumstances.
Sure. No problem.
But I cannot appreciate your time enough.
By the way, I go to bed around Shkiat Chama and I wake up around... I wake up in time for Tefillas Shachar, but yeah, no, it's not at all, man. Thanks for having me, and I really appreciate it. And I think our first couple of weeks of shows have been selling out or are sold out, but we release holds every day. And also, if people really want tickets to the show, they can always reach out, and I try to. Yeah, people can go online. I think there'll be tickets still. Hopefully there'll still be some tickets available when this airs. But all right, thank you so much, David. Appreciate you having me.
Freilich and Purim, thank you so much, Alex. All the best.
Freilich and Purim.
One of the points that really stuck with me that Alex highlighted, and I think we need to remind ourselves, is about the universality of particularity. It's that in our very specific stories, in our very specific struggles, there is something very universal buried in there. And I think a lot of times we see the way national media, Hollywood discusses Jewish life, Orthodox life, and we get very frustrated. And we need to realize that we are sitting on our own stories, and we have to have the ability, the vision, and the perspective to be able to share our own particularity with the larger world. There's an idea I want to leave our episode with, and I hope you'll permit me to do so. I may have mentioned this before, but it's an idea I take with me when I go into Purim. I remember in my year in Israel, I believe war broke out in either 2002, 2003, on Purim. And I remember there were people we had to rush back to the dorms and put on gas masks, and really that Purim experience highlighted this very incongruity. And it always brings me back to this idea that has animated my relationship to comedy in general. It animates my relationship to Purim. And that is, there's something very strange, very curious that we do when we read the Megillah. When the Megillah retells the story of the Jews feasting at the palace of Achashverosh, this was not a meal that they were supposed to partake in, and it was a meal that kind of led to the great punishment that serves as the tension of all of Purim. When we read this part of the Megillah, we do something very strange. Instead of using the normal tune, what's known as the trup, when we lane and read from the Megillah, we actually take in and we read the trup from Megillah Eicha, from the Book of Lamentations that we normally read on Tisha B'Av. When we read the Kelim Mikelim Shonim, that they were partaking from these old vessels, that Achashverosh took out the vessels from the temple in Jerusalem, and the Jews were partying with them. We read it with the sad tune, the tune from Lamentations, from Eicha, that we read each year on Tisha B'Av. It always struck me, like why are we bringing in a tune from a different Megillah? Like, what are we trying to do here? Trying to build the tension? Is this the Megillah equivalent of the Jaws soundtrack? Trying to build tension and convince people like this doesn't end well. We know how the Megillah ends, and there are a lot of Megillahs and stories that we read. We don't normally find the need to bring in a tune from outside the Megillah in order to build tension. Why do we do this here, and why do we do that now? And for me, I've always thought of the imagery of two friends who are struggling with something together. Maybe they're struggling with getting married, finding their respective loved ones. Maybe they're struggling with a similar illness, a similar difficulty at work. But the two friends who are always confiding in one another, long drives back together, kind of pouring their hearts out about their respective struggles, and they're in this journey together until finally one of these friends has their redemption. They do get married. They finally at their own wedding. And you can imagine one of those friends, and I've been in this situation myself, or at my own wedding or at somebody else's wedding when I wasn't married. You're there and you're like, we had so much time together where we were commiserating, lifting one another up, and now you're watching one of your friends kind of move on to that next stage. You can imagine at that wedding, this friend is in the middle of the circle, incredibly joyful, and out of the corner of his eye, he sees that friend who remembers all the long rides in the conversation, kind of sitting off to the side. It's not a part of the simcha, not a part of this joy, and feels so distant, so removed from everything taking place. The fact that they were so close for so long, commiserating over the same difficulties, the same suffering, the same pain, only highlights the incongruity and the distance in the current moment to be sitting at a wedding of a close friend, and only one of them, of course, is getting married. And it's at that moment that I could imagine a friend walking out from the center circle. The groom, the chassan, walks out from the center circle, and he finds that friend sitting on a chair, maybe off to the side, and he pulls them in to the center of the circle. And without saying anything explicitly, they're able to look at one another, and implicitly, by dancing together in that center circle, they're reminding one another that your story has not yet unfolded. That even though only one of us is actualizing that redemption, that destination, that final leg of their journey right now, your story is still unfolding, and both of us deserve to have this moment together of joyousness in the center circle. And I think in many ways this is what we're doing on Purim when we read the Megillah, that we look out and we see Tisha B'Av sitting off to the side. It's Purim, it's a wedding, it's joyous, it's Adar, it's Simcha, It's all of these incredibly uplifting feelings. Out of the corner of our eye, we see Tisha B'Av. We see that story that has not yet completely unfolded, that story that has not yet been completely resolved. And we take Tisha B'Av by both hands and we bring it into the center circle and we begin dancing together. And we look at Tisha B'Av in the eye and say that you, Tisha B'Av, are just a Purim that has not yet completely unfolded. But you too are a story that one day will merit that joyousness that we're experiencing right now. And I think even more conceptually, this is what we do for all of the difficulties in our life on Purim. And when we enter Purim on a day with so much suffering, with so much difficulty going on in the world, we look at all of that pain sitting off outside on those center tables and we try to draw it in to whatever joyousness we're able to experience on Purim and remind ourselves that whatever pain and suffering we see in the world, we see in our lives, the prayer and joy, inspiration, and the general uplifting of Purim, we're able to bring all of that suffering in the world with us into that center circle. And I'm hoping for all of us as we enter a Purim with a great deal of suffering, with a great deal of difficulty. I hope we're able to look at all of the pain and suffering sitting off across the side, all of those Tisha B'Av moments, those Tisha B'Av feelings, those feelings of lamentation, and find a way and find a window that we're able to grab those feelings of suffering and pain with both hands and be able to dance with it, to inject some measure of hope and optimism, even when the world, even when parts of our lives feel so bleak. And as we dance together, Purim and Tisha B'Av, our joy and our pain, I hope all of us are able to get a taste, not only despite the suffering of the world, but maybe because of all the suffering of the world, that we need the redemptive spirit of Purim to hopefully uplift the world, our communities, our families, and all of us, wishing all of our listeners an uplifting and inspiring Purim for yourselves and for your families. Thank you so much for listening. This episode was edited by Dina Emerson, and it wouldn't be a Jewish podcast without a little bit of Jewish guilt. So if you enjoyed this episode, please subscribe, rate, review, tell your friends about it. You can also donate at 1840.org/donate. That's 18forty.org/donate. Subscribing, rating, reviewing, telling your friends about it, or donating, or all of the above. It really helps us reach new listeners and continue putting out great content. You can also leave us a voicemail with feedback or questions that we may play in a future episode. The number for our voicemail is 917-720-5629. Once again, that's 917-720-5629. Don't panic. You don't have to leave your name, and if it really makes you feel better, feel free to disguise your voice. If you'd like to learn more about this topic or some of the other great ones we've covered in the past, then be sure to check out 1840.org. Once again, that's the number 18, followed by the word 40, FORTY.org, where you can also find videos, articles, recommended readings, and of course our weekly emails. Be sure to sign up. Thank you so much for listening, and stay curious, my friend.